And now for something quite different, but just as challenging to solve, I think, the thorny question of author identity and disambiguation. So Laurie Haak from Orchid is going to tell us all about that. Thank you, Laurie.
Thank you. All right, so I hope you all are properly caffeinated. I know you're heading into lunch soon. I have 30 slides in 10 minutes. So, hold on. Okay, names are messy. At Orchid, we focus on names for people, and there are all kinds of reasons why names are messy. I think my favorite one of the day is the person on our panel who shares her name with two other people in the community. One, a biologist, I just gave it away, didn't I? One, a biologist, another one is a person who specializes in alien abduction. So can you imagine somebody looking you up on the internet and finding this alien abduction stuff and going, is this person for real? So yeah, this is really important, having a way to accurately identify and inform search results using digital names is a key part of everything we do, whether you're a publisher, a university, a researcher, an association, et cetera. It's very, very critical. So names are messy. But we're not just talking about names for people here. This is really any kind of text-based name, and we'll get into my noun game in a minute. But one of the things people say is, this is just a problem we have to live with. No, actually, we don't. Names are messy. We can clean them up. We need to use digital names, we need to use persistent identifiers, and we all need to be part of the solution to this. This is something where if everyone does a little bit, everyone will, you won't be overwhelmed, and we'll end up with a really nice solution at the end of the day. So what's Orchid's role? I'm sure probably most of you know about Orchid. I'm hoping by now. What we do at Orchid is provide a registry of persistent identifiers for people, in particular researchers and people involved with the research community. So Orchid is not just for authors, Orchid is for people who create data sets. Orchid is also for editors, publishers, grants management folks, librarians, anyone involved in the research community, okay? The goal of Orchid, as it says here, is to provide these identifiers to distinguish researchers from each other. And if anyone has a little handy, you can type in that URL and you get a little prize. I'm not quite sure what yet. I have an orange. You'll get an orange if you can figure out who that person is and shout it out. Just shout it at any time. All right, so Orchid is a hub. This is the most important thing. If this is all you retain from my talk, Orchid is a hub. We at Orchid connect identifiers together. That is our sole and core mission, okay? So we help enable connections between people identifiers and identifiers, other identifiers for people, identifiers for creative works, and identifiers for organizations. So here's my nouns: people, places, and things. Everyone in the community needs to embrace this concept of identifiers for people, places, and things, okay? Because it's the core of linked data, it's the core of interoperability, right? Identifiers and the connection between them provide what I like to call plumbing, the core research infrastructure, all right? But also, not just connections, it's also enabling us to understand who made the connection and when. So we can start to talk about trust. Okay? Organizations in the community are engaging, they are collaborating. I'm going to talk about two larger collaborations that we've been involved with at Orchid. This is not one of those two, but it is one of many that we're involved in. This involves connecting identifiers for people and organizations. So this is an example of an organization coupling an identifier for a person with an identifier for an organization, and then making an assertion that these two identifiers are related to each other in the form of employment. So you now end up with a public electronic record that asserts this person works for this organization, and with a record that the assertion is made by the organization themselves. So as a publisher, I'm hoping the wheels are spinning in your head and you can say, where are all those use cases where I really want to know that this person actually works for this organization. And I want to be able to access the assertion that these two are related in the correct time frame. I'm pretty sure you can think of many situations where this might be helpful in publishing, and I'll bring up one of them in a few minutes. So, for this to work, we all need to use something called authentication. If there is any publisher in this audience that is allowing someone to include their ORCID identifier by typing it in, go back and stop. Do not do that. It is very important that we in the community, not just publishers, but anyone using these identifiers for the purposes of trust, use something called authentication. This is my longest slide. Because we need to be assured that the person belongs to that identifier, and that identifier is actually the correct one. If somebody types something in, who knows what they're going to type? You all know that with email addresses already. You have to use authentication, please. If you have an issue with authentication, there are several vendors in the room here you can talk to. Use their platform, or talk to us, and we're happy to help you through how to implement OAuth in your system. Please, please, please use authentication. All right, the other piece here at the bottom, I forgot to read, has to do with trust of the individual. There's a lot of work being done in the area of privacy. I'm sure many of you have seen the recent ECJ ruling, lots of fun for people using Safe Harbor. Individuals have to opt in to data transfer. And if you use authentication, you have the perfect opportunity to explicitly ask for permission for access and data transfer privileges. Very, very important. All right, moving on. So trust. I've been talking a lot about trust, building a trust framework using identifiers, authentication, and assertions. So here's an example, one of the collaborations I wanted to talk about, and this is a collaboration with Crossref, also with DataCite, and numerous other organizations, publishers are at the front of this, right? So here's an individual who, I don't know if I'm not gonna worry about it. On the top here, maybe this will work. Anyway, you can see my person dancing with their ORCID. They go to submit a manuscript, and yay, their publisher is asking them to include their ID. Hooray, the ID now becomes a part of the submitted manuscript. And some, but not all publishers, are then including the ID during production. Please start to do this if you aren't already, and I'm hoping this slide gives you the encouragement to do so. So now the manuscript's been accepted, it goes through production process, and at the end of the day, or at some point during the day, that metadata, those metadata are submitted to Crossref to get your DOI, right? Now, a piece of the metadata that can be submitted to Crossref is that ORCID identifier, or ORCID identifiers for the author on the paper. Okay, now if Crossref receives an identifier from you, and that identifier is validated, meaning you used authentication to collect it, then they are working with us to notify the author, hey, we got a publication of yours, and then to update that author's ORCID record with the publication information. So you now have this fully validated turnaround of information and a massive benefit for your author. Hey, your record will be updated, and if your ORCID record's updated, all the systems that are pulling data from ORCID are also updated. Suddenly, those 23 plus profile systems that researchers are trying to maintain have an automated way to update the latest research paper and include the DOI back to the source metadata, right? This is a big deal for researchers. It's also a big deal for publishers because you've now got asserted connections between an author and their papers, right? This is pretty cool. So Ed is here from Crossref. He'll be talking a little bit more about this at his stand, and there'll be some press releases coming out in the next 2 weeks or so. There's a Crossref webinar on this on the 29th of October. DataCite is doing something similar for datasets. This is a big deal collaboration, and I'm really, really thrilled to be working with Crossref on this. So thanks, Ed, for all of your work on this. Okay, a little bit more. Why do we care? Through using these identifiers, we can enhance discoverability, reduce the form filling and the errors that come around with form filling and the irritation of authors that comes around with form filling, streamline reporting workflows, post-publication reporting workflows, and also I think the big one for me is improving trust in this framework. Okay, now you asked me to talk about peer review. I'm going to try to do this in 5 minutes or less. I'm going to do a hand-raising exercise. How many of you in the audience knew anything about Peer Review Week a couple weeks ago? Oh, that's great. Yes. Okay, so this was something that we launched a collaboration with. I think we started talking about it in August or something, and 3 weeks later we had Peer Review Week. So sometimes collaborations are pretty quick and have a pretty high impact. I listed the collaborators on the bottom: Orchid, Science Open, Sense About Silence, and Wiley. And this really was we launched Peer Review Week. A lot of people talk about it. Let's actually try to focus a conversation on the good things and the challenges we have. So with peer review, like with publications, there are questions and challenges around trust, right? But there's also questions and challenges that you have about incentivizing people to actually participate in peer review. You don't have that problem with papers. Everyone wants to publish, but not everyone wants to review. So what we looked at Orchid is how can we be involved in a process to encourage participation in peer review and solve a couple other problems along the way. So with Faculty of 1,000, we co-chaired a community working group to identify a way to actually cite peer review. If you're going to cite a peer review activity, what would that citation look like? What data fields would there be? And we came up with this list of data fields for citing peer review. Person, review, subject, and organization. This doesn't mean you need to publish the actual review report. It doesn't mean that you have to say this person reviewed this paper. It's really a way of saying this person reviewed for this journal or book or whatever in this year, month, whatever level of aggregation you want to put it at. It is possible to review, to cite a review. There are some challenges around this I'll get into in a minute, but it is possible to cite. So we said, if we have a structure for citing peer review, can we actually put this into practice and see if it would actually work? And so we launched at Orchid, we launched an early adopter program, and I'll talk about who participated in that project in a minute. The concept here is person is invited to provide a review by the publisher, or maybe it's a post-publication peer review platform, whatever, the person is involved in review. During that process of invitation, they are requested to provide their ID, again using authentication. Okay, the publisher goes through the process of going through the peer review thing, and then you can then verify that this person actually did provide a review and post that review citation to Orchid, whether it's at the time of the review or once a year, whenever you want to do it, to go and test this workflow, okay? Whoops. So one of the questions was, how can we make sure the reviewer actually opts into this process? Do they want to expose the fact that they've done a review? Okay, so this is a workflow. This is an example from Publons, but not the only example out there. We're also working with EJP and the American Geophysical Union and a few others on this. But here's one of the screens. You know, the reviewer can say, yeah, actually, when I complete this review, I would like information about the review to be posted to my Orchid record. I would like to be acknowledged publicly for this. You can also look at, there's a lot of information inside a review management system. Not all of that should go outside of that review system. A lot of that's confidential. So what does this look like? So transforming what the publisher data is into something that would go and be posted externally, for example, at Orchid. What is the individual's identifier? What is the review year and month? What is the activity? Did they review or were they an editor? What organization sponsored the review, the journal, the funder, et cetera. This isn't just for publishers. What is the review identifier? This tends to be the one that gets everyone stuck, review identifier. And then the source and date of the post. So the challenges, again, the review activity, as Orchid, I said, Orchid's a hub connecting identifiers, so we need to start thinking about identifiers for reviews. In some cases, you can think about a DOI because the review report itself is published. But in many cases, the review is not published, right? So how do we come up with an identifier for the review? This is a challenge I'm going to throw back to you guys, and I'm going to also show an example of how one platform is dealing with it. And again, connections between these identifiers must be made using authentication. When you invite a person to come in for review, please ask them to authenticate their ID. So here's an example of verified reviews. You have a publisher that holds data using an intermediary, in this case it was Publons, to provide a repository. And those identifiers can then be assigned in the repository. In many ways, this is analogous to what Crossref is doing with DOIs. Okay, there's a repository that holds some metadata and then manages a registry of persistent identifiers in coordination with the publishers to be able to provide source data, source metadata around that review activity. Okay, verified reviews, those that the publisher has validated, can get posted over to the ORCID record. Okay, so it isn't just a person saying I did a review, it's a publisher asserting that this person did a review, and that is what can be moved over. All right, so where are we with this? Some journals are starting to collect ORCID IDs from reviewers. Some funders are really interested in this and are starting to plan workflows for collecting IDs for the reviewers. We are launching a user interface to be able to display those peer review activities. And also, as I said, we're in the in the early adopter stage of APIs, but that also all will be launched, I think, in the next couple weeks. And we also had this early adopter program underway with, as I mentioned, AGU, eJournal Press, Faculty of 1,000 Publons, and some other platforms. And those are launching this month. Okay, so why do we care? This will enhance discoverability of the reviewers, which I know for pretty much everyone in this audience is a big deal. You have a hard time finding reviewers. If you can make reviewers more discoverable, it helps you, but it also helps the reviewer. It also makes peer review activities measurable. Peer review is a very serious time commitment and a very serious scholarly commitment in this community. It's something that we need to acknowledge. We need to make it possible for people to say and be proud of and be acknowledged for their peer review activities. All right, so from the researcher perspective, researchers really only need to do two things to benefit from all of these things that I've talked about. They need to register and they need to use their ID. I need your help with the second part. We can do the first part. Register, use the ID. We're not asking them to do anything else. Very, very simple. Each part takes about 30 seconds. What do we want you to do? Sorry, this is very US-based, isn't it? Sorry. We want you to encourage your journal to use identifiers for people, places, and things, for all of them. Okay, to ask your authors and reviewers for their identifier using authentication, and also take part in the auto-update process. That means getting that ID and passing it all the way through production to your Crossref submission. All right, so be a part of collecting the identifiers, help us build a trust framework, help us encourage and incentivize participation in peer review. And I'm going to end with this quote from Jonathan Cram at the Wellcome Trust. The ability to uniquely identify contributors is a deceptively simple concept which could enable forms of real-time understanding of scientific research that up to now have been extremely costly, if not impossible. And think of all the wonderful things we could do if we actually knew when things come out, and the wonderful third-party or publisher-party systems that you could build on top of these kinds of notification systems. So with that, I'll end. Thank you very much.